Hello dear chess friends, my name is Andrey Ostrovskiy. I'm an international master originally from Ukraine, and in this lesson we will discuss very important topic of mobilization in chess. Another common term for mobilization is a development, and my main goal is to show you why development matters. I also want to give you some rules, some general principles that you can use over the board. So for these purposes, I've prepared a brilliant game of Rossolimo. Rossolimo was a well-known master of the past. By the way, one of popular opening lines in the Sicilian named after him. So this game was played against Romanenko in 1948, but it is still very actual and interesting to see. So let's get to the game. It has started with e4. c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. Exactly the Rossolimo line. So white's main idea is to complete the development as fast as possible, so to castle at first, and then to come up with some active play in the center. So usually white does this with the help of c3 and d4, trying to occupy the center with pawns to control most important central squares, and at the same time to try to build up very strong pawn center. Black played g6, which is a very logical idea, because as we can see, it is not that simple to find a good place for the bishop on initial diagonal f8, a3. So here, after g6, black wants to put the bishop on g7, from where this bishop will exert some pressure on the long diagonal and also control the situation in the center. So white plays castles. Bishop goes to g7, rook goes to e1. So you can see that castling is a very important move, because it is not only makes the king's position much safer, but at the same time it gives a chance to one of rooks to be activated quite quickly. So here rook goes to e1. Black plays knight to f6, also quite logical development move. So now, as you can see, black is also ready for castling, which means black is about to complete the development at this moment. And the knight controls some central squares. At first glance, looks like white has a great possibility just to play e5 here, attacking the knight f6 and forcing the knight moving, which means the knight will move 2 times in the opening stage. By the way, it is the first important moment to remember and to understand as well. So when the piece moves several times in the opening, it usually leads to wasting the time. So all that time that is spent on moving the piece can be alternatively spent on developing other pieces, right? So it looks like e5 wins the time for white and stops black's development, or at least interferes with the plan of quick development. In fact, after e5, the knight goes to d5. And actually what happens here, white just helped black to improve the position of this knight. Because on f6, it wasn't that great. On d5, it occupies very good central position itself. At the same time, as you can see, there is a maneuver, knight c7, knight e6, controlling the situation in the center better than from f6. So, as we already discussed, while one of white's main ideas here is to play c3 and d4, occupying the center. So when the knight through c7 goes to e6, it controls d4 additionally, which means that this interferes with white's main plan. So e5 just gives black a chance to improve the position of the knight, which means this move is not that great. So instead of that, white played knight to c3, which is another logical decision. So white continues the development. So white develops another piece. Now the knight c3, as you can see, controls d5 square, and e5 move becomes a real threat, which actually black completely missed in this game and made the first mistake. So black played knight d4, a very dubious decision, because as we can see, black was not forced to make this move. Why this move is so dubious? At first glance, it looks like a natural idea, just to occupy central square to blockade white's d2 pawn, to create some concrete threats, and so on. But the first drawback is that the knight moves the second time already, which means it wastes the time, which could be alternatively spent on the development, on castling, for example. Another drawback is that this move ignores white's threat of e5. So after knight c3, d5 is controlled, so e5 becomes really nasty. So normal way for black to play is castling, of course, just continuing the normal development, normal plan. And now after e5, which looks just natural after knight c3, the knight goes to e8. So as you can see, king went to g8, so this square is possible to occupy. At first glance, again, it looks like an ugly position for the knight, but again, due to the maneuver that we already discussed, knight c7, knight e6, and controlling d4, maybe even occupying d4 in the future, this knight becomes even better than on f6, where it was more or less limited with white's pawn e4, for instance. So it starts influencing the position much better when going to e6. And to be honest, it is a typical maneuver, typical route for the knight in this opening line. So castling could have solved black's main problem, so to meet the threat of white's e4, e5. That was just natural. Instead, black made this strange move, knight to d4. Well, to be honest, it is also a typical idea for black, but not in the opening stage. So it is a typical maneuver for the middle game stage when black is definitely ready for it. Here, black is not ready. White continues with the natural e5. And now we can see black's problem. So knight on f6 is attacked, and in fact, black has no good squares for this knight. So e8 is engaged, so it's not possible to maneuver the knight to c7 and then to e6. h5 square will be just awful on the edge of the board. g4 is also not a good square, because after that white continues with the h3 attacking the knight. Knight is forced to another ugly position on h6. In fact, after e5, black has really unpleasant choice. So g4, h5 are bad. So what else? Knight to g8. Actually, this move black chose in the game. So knight simply goes back to the initial position, which means black lost enormous amount of time in the opening. Castling is not possible now. So to make castling, black will have to spend additional time, for example, by developing the knight again on this ugly position on h6 or something like that, or maybe playing e6, knight to e7. So it takes time, as you can see. By this moment, white made no bad moves at all. So white made only useful moves, which means that white is almost completed a development. And what does it mean? It means that white is ready to create concrete threats. Black still struggles to complete a development. All the pieces occupying initial positions can't make an impact, can't influence the situation on the board, and you will see that it can lead to very quick disaster. So after knight g8, white continues with another natural move, d3, preparing the development of the dark squared bishop. So it is ready to occupy active positions on f4, or maybe on g5. And black makes another mistake. So having such a situation in the opening, when you lost a lot of time and you're still not developed, your king is still not castled, it signals that it's necessary to be very fast with the development, so at least to hide the king. It is one of the major goals in the development process, so to make your king safe, so to castle, in other words. So even knight h6 here looks more or less fine. At least it prepares castling, making the king safe. So in the game, black took on b5, which is another not forced move with the same piece. So actually this knight already made two moves before this exchange, and now after knight b5, it is the third move in a row with the same piece, which only activates white's knight c3. So on c3, the knight was already more or less active, but on b5 it becomes even more active because now the knight, as you can see, is very close to opponent's king. It is very dangerous for black. And black probably overestimating his defensive resources, overestimating his position, and definitely underestimating white's attacking possibilities here. Just carelessly played a6, attacking the knight, because at first sight it looks like this move provokes the knight back to c3 position. In fact, white already has so great advantage in development, so great advantage in time. Almost all black's pieces occupy initial squares. Only the bishop on g7 is more or less developed, but still not that active. And white's pieces are ready to tear black's king apart. So instead of moving the knight passively to c3, white jumped with the knight on d6, which is very good move. The only possibility here for black to try to protect the position was not to capture this knight, but to move the king to f8. Of course, after that, white has a huge advantage because now, in addition to advantage in time, advantage in development, white managed opponent's king to lose the right to castle, but it was still a possibility to keep fighting with black. Instead, black just took on d6, grabbing the knight. But what happens after that? White is about to open up the e-file completely, just starting the direct attack against the king. Means e5 takes d6, unleashing the power of the rook. And at the same time, as you can see, diagonal h4, d8 became open. So white has a chance to complete the development with the tempo. So bishop goes to g5 first, simply attacking the queen and adding another attacking resource to this attack against the king. So bishop goes to g5. What to do with black here? Looks like it is already a big problem. Queen is attacked. There are several methods of protecting the queen, including just going away with the queen, but all those moves work very bad for black. Let's have a look. So if black, let's say, plays f6 here, white simply takes on f6 with check. So as we can see, rook now attacks the king. King goes away somewhere, it doesn't matter where actually, and then pawn takes on g7. And now we can see a problem. So the queen is attacked simultaneously with the rook. So white not only regained the sacrificed minor piece by taking the bishop on g7, but at the same time achieves a great material advantage because inevitably white wins a queen here, either taking the queen on d8 or promoting pawn on g7 by taking the rook on h8 to a queen. So this is completely lost. Let's say another possibility, knight e7, protecting the queen and trying to castle next move, so black simply has no time anymore. e5 takes d6. You can see the knight is pinned, so it can't move away somewhere. White will inevitably capture this knight next move, and it is a complete disaster. For example, if castles, then pawn takes on e7 with a fork, attacking the queen and the rook, and again, white managed to regain a sacrificed minor piece and at the same time achieves even more, so by taking the rook next move, for instance. And finally, if queen goes to c7 after bishop g5, well, white wins immediately with the same e5 takes d6 with check and simultaneously attacking the queen on c7. So next move will be d6 takes c7 with an extra queen. So in the game, black decided to put the queen on another square. Queen a5 was played. Actually looks like a safe place because white can't disturb the queen at the moment, but white's main target here is the king. By the way, moves like queen a5, an early development of the queen in the game, are quite risky usually because the early developed queen becomes a simple target for opponent's pieces. So the problem for the queen is that it is the strongest piece in chess, so it is not a good idea to defend it when it is attacked by the minor piece, for example. It leads to a catastrophic material disadvantage. So every time when the queen is attacked, it is literally forced to move somewhere, and this leads to the situation that we already discussed. So moving the same piece several times. That's a problem with the early development of the queen. But in this particular case, in this particular example, it's not an issue, of course. to move the queen on a5. It is literally only possibility for black. The same as queen b6, so it makes no difference actually. But as a general rule, remember, so early development of the queen usually leads to wasting the time, to losing the time, and so on. So bad consequences. In a game, white took on d6, of course, natural continuation of the attack. Now the rook controls e-file exclusively, attacking the king on e8 and forcing the king to move. So king goes to f8, only move for black. And now white's task is to connect other pieces. So we can see that still rook a1, for example, doesn't take part in the game, but what is more importantly, queen on d1 is still passive. So to connect the queen to the attack, white makes an amazing rook to e8 move. So sacrificing the rook, but at the same time decoying the king to the e-file, which helps white to connect the queen with the tempo. So pay attention to this method. So white sacrifices some material, but at the same time, white gives an opponent no chances to complete a development. It is a very powerful way of developing the initiative. So it was possible to connect the queen with the help of queen e2, but this gave black some time for making developing moves and maybe gave black some tiny chances to survive it. Rook a8 gives no chances because black simply has no time for developing moves. You may ask why white is not afraid of being so much material down. Because white understands a very important feature of positions like this one. So only developed material matters. Actually, the fact that black has so much material doesn't matter here, because not developed material is a dead material. Actually, all those pieces like, let's say, rook on a8, bishop on c8, they just don't take part in the process. The same is about, let's say, rook on h8. So knight g8, of course, influences the position somehow, so it at least protects something, as well as queen on a5 and so on. But those pieces just don't take part in the game. They don't make an impact. So we can consider them not present on the board at all, because they can't change the situation. They can't change the way the game goes. That's the point here. So only developed and active pieces matter in chess. So after rook e8, the only move for black is to take the rook, and after that queen goes to e2 with check. And that is a decisive continuation, so king is forced back to f8, bishop goes to e7 now. Another powerful check. And it appears that, again, black has no chance to capture the bishop. For example, after knight takes e7, queen takes e7, king goes to g8, white simply continues with the attack against f7 pawn, and black has no defense. So all the extra material means nothing here. All that pieces can't help in protecting the f7 pawn, which means that queen f7 is inevitable and it will be just a checkmate. Doesn't matter what black does. Let's say h6, queen takes f7, checkmate. The king is completely limited here. So after bishop e7, king goes to e8, only move. And now white just weakens f7 square by deflecting the king from that pawn. Bishop goes to d8. Another powerful sacrifice, and very nice one. So now we can see it is another check, and at the same time the queen on a5 is hanging. So let's say if king goes back to f8, bishop simply takes on a5 and white has an extra queen. Black has no chances to survive it. So king should take on d8, and now knight goes to g5. And we can see a problem. So f7 is hanging, the king is completely limited here. It's not possible to change the situation with the king. Knight f7 is a threat of a checkmate. So let's say if black tries to complete a development on the queen side, knight simply takes on f7 with the checkmate, nowhere to go. So the only way for black to protect f7 square is knight to h6, but after that we can see that black lost the control over e7 square, and queen simply goes to e7 with the checkmate. That's it. Game is over. So it was a nice game with a lot of sacrifices, But all that sacrifices were possible only because of White's great advantage in time and development. You should understand that these consequences of crazy attacks against opponent's scheme are very common when one of the sides has this sort of advantage. I hope it was interesting, so it's time to conclude our today's lesson. So let's get directly to conclusive statements. There are general principles behind mobilization. They could be good rules to direct your thinking over the board. So, only developed pieces matter. Avoid moving the piece several times. Be careful with an early development of the queen. Do not make too many moves with pawns. Develop your pieces as fast as possible. Consider moves that stop opponent's development. Be ready to sacrifice material to win the time. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next lessons.